Hi, Year 11 and Year 10. In this video we're going to look at Bayonet Charge. It's on page 36 of your anthology. In this video you'll see that I've done the notes straight onto the anthology to show you how you should record your notes, but in future videos I'll do it on a PowerPoint and that might make it easier for some of you to read. So the first thing to think about is we've got 15 poems here. And we've got to have a strategy, we've got to have a plan for how we're going to learn and remember all of these for the exam. We're not trying to understand every single bit about the poem and remember every single bit. That would be impossible. So we're going to look at select quotations and focus on them. Now you will see that there are a lot of notes on this page already, despite the fact that I've only pulled out and highlighted select bits. It's not enough to highlight, you must make notes to make sure that you understand. So as you're watching and listening, you need to pause the video to make sure you've got notes at different points. I'll briefly look at what the poem is about, but I'm going to assume that you have already read through this poem. You need to read it at least twice. Even better, you can find a video of somebody reading it to you, and then you can really listen and hopefully their intonation, their voice will help you to understand it. So, we have to write about three things. We have to write about AO1, which is our kind of personal response to the poem and using quotations, showing our understanding. We also have to include AO2, which is our subject terminology and our analysis of language and structure. And then also AO3, which is a bit about context and writer's ideas, although this isn't worth as many marks as the other bits. So, this poem is written by a guy called Ted Hughes. He was alive between 1930 and 1998. So he was born after World War I, but he lived through World War II. So this is what I've just noted down here that it's important for you to copy down. His father fought in World War I, but he himself didn't. His father was traumatised. He really struggled when he came back from World War I. And this affected Hughes's own upbringing. So Hughes himself grew up in a post-World War I society, that means after World War I, and he lived through World War II. So he grew up in a post-war society, is what we call it, after war essentially. And he was very aware of its influence and its impact on society, even though he didn't fight himself. Now the poem itself, Bayonet Charge, is just a snapshot. It begins with a man who wakes up, jumps up and starts running towards the enemy or towards a green hedge. He stops in the middle, that's verse 2, to question what he's doing and thinking about, why he's there on the battlefield. And then in verse 3, a hare dies, it gets shot, and he carries on running towards the enemy. And that is all that happens. So it's literally just a snapshot where we're really focused on what he's thinking. Let's look at the first verse. So the first verse goes down to this bit here, chest. As I say, you should have already read it. And I'm only going to focus on these bits that are highlighted, okay? I don't expect you to even try to understand any of the other bits in the poem. Even if this was the named poem, as you can see from the amount of notes on the page, this will give you plenty to write about. Let's have a look at this first line. Suddenly he awoke and was running -raw. Okay, just this bit here. Make sure you've got that highlighted. And at any point, if you need to stop and pause the video to make notes, that's absolutely fine. Firstly, we need to mention the method that's being used here, which is in media res. That means that it starts in the middle of the action. Something's already been established, this soldier's already gone to war and is on the battlefield in the trenches, and then suddenly they wake up. The word suddenly has connotations of chaos, which is firstly establishing our interpretation of what it's like to be at war. Let's look at some of the other things in this line then. The in media res starts off by creating a sense of confusion and shock. The soldier is panicking and is on high alert. And what's actually happening here is Hughes is trying to incite and mirror the same emotions that a soldier would experience in the reader. So because we don't really know what's going on at this point, the reader feels the same emotions as the soldier. That's because what Hughes is trying to achieve here is he's trying to get us to experience what war is really like. He's trying to open our eyes to the suffering and the harsh reality of what war was for the soldiers. First word, we can then say quite a lot just about this little word, he. Suddenly he awoke and was running. Firstly, the writer's using a personal pronoun. I'm just going to pull my notes down so that you can see what I've got written up here. The personal pronoun here is ambiguous. The soldier's got no name. And Hughes has done this deliberately to create this kind of sense of it being vague. The soldier in this poem could represent all soldiers. It could be about any war, though technically it was based on World War I. The fact that he's got no name makes the soldier seem unimportant or insignificant, as if he's disposable, and we'll pick this theme up later on in the poem, where we get the idea that the government don't care about the soldiers that they're sending to fight on the front line. The other thing that's important to note here is this is the only person in the poem. And this creates a sense of isolation for the soldier and reminds us of how hard life was for soldiers when they were at war. Even though there would be other soldiers around, they were very much cut off from society and the rest of their family. So he seems isolated. And again, this reinforces this idea of anonymity. It's as if no one cares. Once they've got him onto the battlefield and got him to sign up for going to war, no one's interested anymore. It's also important to note is connect this with what we know about Hughes as well. So the fact that he's using a third person perspective links to the fact that Hughes hadn't actually experienced war himself. He's not saying I awoke because he never went to war, so he distances it by using this third person narrative. This also then heightens the loneliness of the soldier because it's creating a distance between us, the reader, and the soldier in the poem. The fact that he's running could convey a sense of fear. And then we'll also have a look at this word raw here. If you need to pause the video and get any of those notes down before we move on, that's absolutely fine. So, there's also a few more notes here about this word awoke. So this could mean that the soldier was asleep. A lot of the time they would have been just waiting for conflict to occur. And sleep here has connotations of safety and healing. We often go to bed and associate that with comfort or like feeling restored. So then he awakes, he often feels the opposite. He doesn't feel safe. He doesn't feel protected. So we can talk about the connotations of him waking up and what that tells us about what it's like to be at war. But there's also a metaphorical interpretation here, or a figurative interpretation. He could be waking up to the reality of war, like this sort of idea of waking up meaning to realise, like I woke up to an idea. He's realised that war isn't what he thought it was. Now let's look at this word raw that appears on the first line and on the second line. Now you can see how many notes I've written already just about that first bit. So sometimes I like to add in a post-it note. Okay, and we're going to look at that here. And again, this helps me to just make notes on particular words that I think are really important. So here the word raw is an adjective. We need to write about the fact that it's an adjective, so we're including our subject terminology, and focusing on individual words within a quotation is going to help us really zoom in on the detail and get us extra marks. So first thing we might want to look at are the connotations of the word raw. Raw could mean something is new or young. He could be raw because he's never seen combat or has never seen conflict before. But it could have another meaning here, this idea of like being dehumanized, almost like a piece of meat. And in this way, he seems like prey. And there's also a sense of like just a discomfort in his clothing that he's wearing. Maybe his clothing is kind of rubbing on his skin. And the word raw is then repeated, so we can also write about the repetition. Now this isn't because Hughes couldn't think of any better words to write. He's done this deliberately, so we've got to think about what's the effect here. It seems kind of clumsy, the fact that it repeats so quickly after the first instance. And it almost seems like a stutter or some kind of struggle. And that reflects maybe how the soldier's feeling waking up and suddenly having to burst into action. Almost like he can't think straight, or he can't express himself, as if he's sort of stumbling over his feet as he starts running because he's still half asleep. But again, it could be this idea that he's kind of waking up to the reality of war and no longer feels like he wants to be there. So we've also got this idea of an internal conflict. He can't really decide what he wants to do or whether he wants to be there anymore. So all of those notes, the first bit in red, are really just focusing on that first line. The other thing that's important to notice here is the green hedge. This is the target. This is what he's running towards. And actually, this enemy here is nature. And then picking out some of these quotations to do with nature means that we can write about this poem in relation to war and soldiers, but we can also use it to link thematically with some of the nature poems. Nature is the victim here. Now, the green hedge again could be a metaphor for the enemy. They could be hiding in the green hedge. They could be wearing green as part of their camouflage. But again, the enemy is anonymous, and that seems to add to the pointlessness. He doesn't even know who he's fighting or what he's fighting. And nature seems to be the target of much of the violence. And we'll pick this up in this next quotation. So the next quotation that I want us to look at is on line 5. Bullets smacking the belly out of the air. Now this could be him firing his rifle, or it could be the enemy. We've got plosive alliteration. That's this harsh sound of bullets and belly. And anytime you get a harsh sounding word like puh or cuh or duh, we can talk about plosive alliteration. It's not enough just a technique spot, so we need to say what the effect of that alliteration could be. Maybe it highlights the violence and aggression that's required by soldiers, and the violence and aggression that they witness on the battlefield. It could also reflect the gunfire, so it's really helping to bring an auditory element to this poem. The reader can really hear the sounds of the trenches and the front line, as well as them being described, so that we can see them and visualise them. We've got other violent words like smacking, this verb here, that's what the V stands for. The N is to remind us that this is a noun, bullets. And they're smacking the belly out of the air. So again, we can see nature is being personified here. It's as if the whole world is a victim here, and the whole world suffers in the event of war. Everything is under attack. Again, if you need to pause whilst you make your notes on that line, then that's really important that you do that. In the next line, line 6, it then goes back to the soldier. He lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm. And again, this simile is rich with meaning. Firstly, that verb lugged is really important. It gives us loads of ideas. Lugged suggests that he is struggling and he doesn't want to carry this rifle. It's heavy. Maybe he's unprepared. So again, we can look at all the different layers of meaning and interpretations just in that one word. But the rifle is numb as a smashed arm. Now this simile here suggests that the rifle has almost become part of him. And again, just like at the beginning when we talked about the word raw, we've got the idea that the soldier is being dehumanized. He's almost robotic or become a machine. His arm and the rifle have become one. But his arm is smashed. So we've also got a sense that he is damaged or debilitated in some way. Now this could mean the kind of literal injuries that soldiers sustained on the battlefield, but it could also be echoing his father's emotional trauma that he experienced when he returned from World War I. Next on line 7 then, we're getting a clue as to why the soldier originally went to war. The patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye. Now here, I know the notes are small. Patriotic, our patriotism is our pride in our country. So here I've written honour and pride. These were his reasons for fighting. Yeah, he thought he was doing a good thing, and he wanted the status, essentially, I guess, of going to war. But we need to pick up on the fact that this is in the past tense. It had brimmed in his eye, and that suggests that it no longer does. Okay, so he seems to have lost his sense of purpose. He doesn't know why he's fighting anymore. Then we move on to verse 2, where the soldier stops. And he thinks, in what cold clockwork of the stars and nations was he the hand pointing that second? Now again, we need to introduce brevity to our quotations. We're not going to remember the whole thing, but if you can remember cold clockwork of the stars and nations and the rhetorical question mark, that's going to be really important. Let's have a look at my notes then. I just need to move my page up. So what we've got here is our first piece of end sentence punctuation. Don't know if you noticed when you were reading verse 1, but there were no full stops at all. We've got a full question mark here, and then we get a full stop later on at this point here. So what's going on here is talking about what the reason is for the man going to war. Okay, he's never really stopped maybe to think about it, but at this point he stops, because it tells us that he stops, and then the question mark makes the reader stop too. Up until this point, the poem has been non-stop, and this mirrors the relentlessness of war. It's never really stopped. And what the soldier's doing here is he's questioning his reasons for war. He's wondering whether it was actually his choice or whether he's just a cog in a bigger machine. And the idea here is that it was probably a cultural expectation that young men went to war. Again, that idea of patriotism and pride. So he's questioning why he made that decision now. And really what the writer, Hughes, is trying to suggest here is soldiers are just physical tools. That's the way society sees them. They just go and fight on the battlefield. They're not sentient beings. It's just me scribbling out where I couldn't fit it on there. So sentient, if you're sentient, it means you're fully aware and feeling. And it seems to me that the soldier is here just being treated as if he's part of a bigger machine. Let's have a look at where those ideas actually come from then and how we have got to that point. So again, if you need to pause it and write those bits down before we go back to that quote, then by all means do. So again, we've got this alliteration, cold clockwork. A clock doesn't stop. It keeps on ticking. That's what I've scribbled there. Doesn't stop. And this is the idea that war just carries on, or society just carries on. And this is quite a harsh mentality. That's what the kind of how we can interpret the word cold here. Again, we've got this plosive alliteration, and it's telling us this idea of war being cold and mechanical. They're sort of just fighting. They're just part, a part of a big machine, fighting against another nation. The fact that he feels that this is written in the stars suggests that maybe that he thinks this was his fate. This is just what's expected of young men. But also then the idea of nations here could represent the government. So he is part of this clockwork. This is where this idea of like he is a cog, just in the society really, with the government telling him that he has to go and fight, and just like a clock, that can't stop. That has to keep going. And again, we see that at the end of the poem, where despite the fact that he stops to think here, he carries on towards the enemy. Now in verse 3 he starts running again, and firstly we've got this image here that often confuses a lot of students, so we're just going to look at this really briefly. A yellow hare suddenly dies, so the field's being shot at, and a hare dies. And we've got a real sense here of the hare maybe symbolising or being a metaphor for the soldier's suffering. The hare is an innocent victim, just like the soldiers are, and then we've got this full stop at the end again to sort of reinforce that his life is over. And this gives us a real sense of the injustice of war and the suffering of the soldiers. So this is just what catches the soldier's eye as he sort of runs past. He notices this hare dying, and he carries on regardless. He plunged past. So he's become very much desensitised to war, and we can link that to that word numb as a smashed arm that we were talking about earlier. And he carries on then running towards the green hedge. So here we've got a circular structure. He was running towards the green hedge at the beginning, and he's still running towards the green hedge now. So what does that mean then? Well, the green hedge is a simple image of nature, and it shows us that he doesn't really have any choice. He's got to keep going and he can't stop, because He was running towards the green hedge at the beginning, and he's still running towards the green hedge now. And this is again where we get this idea linked with the old idea of cold clockwork, that he's just a cog in a bigger machine, and he has no choice or chance to stop anymore. And then finally, we get the last section here. He says, king, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. So again, we're only interested in the highlighted bits. What we've got here is a list: king, honour, human dignity. And these could be all the reasons for going initially to war. The list helps to exaggerate it. There were lots and lots of reasons for going to war, to honour his king, the honour that he would get from being a soldier, because he thought it was the right thing to do by society and by other people. But those reasons are no longer important. Etc. means like, and so on, as if he can't even be bothered to explain them anymore. So he seems to really disregard his original sense of purpose. And these reasons that he wanted to fight initially have dropped like luxuries. Now this simile here suggests that these reasons are no longer important. And the fact that he's comparing them to luxuries helps us to focus on the soldier's basic needs. He's just trying to survive. Survival is the only thing that's important now, and the reasons no longer matter. So as you can see, just focusing on those 7 lines, there's no space to write anymore, but I have got a few other little bits just to share with you. Just like we did with writing about Raw, just going to come back to this quote here: he lugged as a rifle, numb as a smashed arm. Because again, I think this word numb is really important. And again, this will help us when we're linking to other poems. So what could we say about the word numb? Maybe his arm is numb because of the cold weather. Again, this links with exposure. We might want to write about, the sort of effect on the battlefield of that kind of thing. Again, he could be mentally numb as well as physically numb. So he's sort of switched off his feelings and he's become emotionless because of the trauma that he's witnessing out there. And again, this could be a kind of coping mechanism. But it could also mean that he's sort of become numb, sort of immune to it, like empty of feeling, as if killing and violence has become really normal for him and he's become immune to the effect of it. Now we see this then when we see him sort of running past the hare. He notices it, but he doesn't stop because he's so used to seeing death all around him. So we've got plenty of things that we can say about language in terms of individual words that we might want to write about and techniques. We can also write about this enjambement. I haven't put the spelling of that word down, but I'll write it down for you in a sec. This idea that the poem doesn't stop, that the lines carry on, the sentences carry on onto the next line until the second verse. So that's going to be really important. But what else can we say about structure? I'm just going to give you some other things to think about here. The structure of the poem also reflects war. So if we look at the structure of the poem, we might want to describe it as chaotic and unpredictable. And that's because there doesn't seem to be any rhythm. There don't seem to be any kind of rules around line lengths. They all seem quite different. Each verse has a different number of lines. That's not consistent, and there's no rhyme anywhere. So this chaotic and unpredictable structure reflects the realities of war. So what we say when there's no kind of pattern here is it's called free verse. So we can make a link between what we're seeing in terms of structure and the harsh realities of war. And we can also write about this enjambement here, which is the fact that the sentences carry on and carry on right until this point here in line 11. So now that we've looked at the whole poem, we might want to think about the writer's ideas. We've talked about them as we go through, but let's just try and summarise them. Hughes felt that war was futile. That means pointless. It was stressful and traumatic. He's also trying to draw our attention to the internal conflict that people felt in terms of going to war, questioning their reasons for going to war in the first place. And again, if we wanted to maybe look at this question in terms of power, the soldier here is ultimately powerless, and he feels like he had no choice. He had to do it because of the kind of cultural expectations on him, or the expectations of the government, and that no one really cares about him. And in this way, we could compare this poem really well with something like Kamikaze. But ultimately he's trying to highlight the suffering that soldiers experienced, and maybe we could interpret this poem as a warning to future generations, to avoid war at all costs. In terms of themes and links then, I've already mentioned a few. There's lots that refer to this poem. We could talk soldier's identity. Now this is a key idea, and we look at it and think poems like Checking Out My History. At the beginning he really he jumps up and he starts fighting, and initially he explains that he did want to be a soldier. He had that patriotic tear, but his identity changes over the course of the poem. He no longer wants to be a soldier. It links to power because he is completely powerless and he feels like he's regretting his decision. Obviously links to war and soldiers. Certainly links this idea of internal conflict. Remember, this group of poems is called Power and Conflict, so we're always thinking about how they relate to these two words. And we could also write about this poem in terms of nature, because nature here is a victim of war. We could write about the bullets smacking the belly out of the air. We can write about the green hedge, and plenty of other quotations that we can pick out. So that gives you plenty of notes there. Obviously you can go back and pause at any point if you were missing anything, and if you've got any questions, do please ask.